Hi all. Today we're going to be transitioning from adolescence into potentially a new period in the lifespan called emerging adulthood, and I'm going to explain that in just a little bit here. But in this little figure, you see that there are different times in the lifespan. We have infancy, we've already covered, childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and adulthood. In terms of who counts as an emerging adult, we're going to talk about five main features in just a second, but purely looking at age, we typically use two terms interchangeably. The term late adolescence I've already been using to some degree when we were talking about adolescence, but typically we're talking about individuals who are about college age. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to college, but just the average college age, so about 18, 21 to 22. For emerging adulthood is including late adolescence. So 18 is usually the starting point, but it can go into the mid to late 20s even. So here you see 25-ish, but it can go into even, let's say, 27, 28. Again, you don't have to be a college student to be classified as an emerging adult. Many of the individuals that we're studying, again using this framework of an emerging adulthood or this time span, are typically college students because those are easy to study. It doesn't have to be a college student. So it's this time period that is between adolescence and adulthood. If we talk about generational data, most of you are going, if not all of you, are going to fall into the Gen Z category. But currently, emerging adults, as it is in 2020, are mostly Gen Z individuals, but there are still some young millennials that still count as emerging adults, just because, again, emerging adulthood is going into the late 20s. This term emerging adulthood isn't that old, I mean, at least relatively speaking. I would say that the term started to emerge in the late 90s and or early 2000s. And essentially what was going on is that researchers were noticing that there seemed to be a longer transition to adulthood. It had become delayed. And so researchers were and developmental psychologists were thinking, is this really a new stage that is emerging? This time period between adolescence and adulthood. We're not just jumping into our adult roles right after high school or maybe even a couple of years out of high school. We don't necessarily become financially independent. We don't necessarily start our significant romantic relationships if that's something we choose to want in our life. We're not jumping into parenthood or marriage or these other roles like we once were. So what's going on? I will tell you that there are arguments that emerging adulthood isn't real. Like it's not its own time period. It's not its own part in the lifespan. Recall that we talked about this with adolescence, that adolescence also hasn't always existed, but now more people are, I mean, most people, if not all people, are going to say that adolescence is its own time in the lifespan. So will that one day happen for emerging adulthood? I don't know, right? We can't predict the future. Many developmental psychologists are on board with this idea that it is like its own part in the lifespan, and the actual cutoffs are going to vary. So does it start at 18? Does it end at 25 or 27 or 28? But that's partly because of individual differences in people's behavior. So you won't find every single person who is studying development or developmental psychology or even sociologists who are interested in these topics saying, yes, emerging adulthood is its own thing. Me personally, I think there's a lot of evidence for emerging adulthood, and we're going to talk about how it's not necessarily universal, but it is commonly experienced and a common part of the lifespan. I've studied emerging adulthood in my own research and actually using those terms. I'm not just talking about late adolescence, but about this time period of being in between. The research originally started with a question of, do you feel that you have reached adulthood? And if we were in person, I'd be asking you guys. So I would ask, raise your hand if you feel like you have reached adulthood. Undoubtedly, there will be some of you who say yes, and part of that is because we have first years and seniors in this class. But there are others that'll be like, no way, I'm not even close. And there's some of you that might feel somewhat in between. So let's look at some data on the next slide of how this question was originally asked and what the researchers found.